The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Westfield University's music department. Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished surface. She had been working as a janitor at the prestigious university for 3 years now, arriving before dawn and leaving long after the students had gone home. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing and cleaning, gripped the mop handle as she began her daily routine. Professor Richard Ashford arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, as he did every morning. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, always dressed in expensive suits that spoke of his status as the head of the music department. His reputation preceded him everywhere he went. He had studied at Juilliard, performed in concert halls across Europe, and now taught only the most talented students at Westfield. Everyone knew his name, and he made sure they never forgot it. Maria was cleaning the practice room windows when Professor Ashford walked past. She nodded politely and stepped aside to let him pass, but he barely acknowledged her presence. To him, she was just part of the furniture, another nameless face among the support staff who kept the building running. He had more important things to think about than a middle-aged janitor in a faded uniform. The morning continued as usual, until Maria's cart accidentally bumped into a music stand near the main rehearsal hall. The metal stand clattered to the floor with a loud crash that echoed through the corridor, sheet music scattered everywhere, floating down like autumn leaves. Maria's heart jumped into her throat. She quickly knelt down to pick up the papers, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Professor Ashford emerged from his office, irritation written across his face. He looked at the mess, then at Maria, and his expression hardened. Several students had gathered in the hallway, curious about the commotion. This was exactly the kind of audience the professor enjoyed when asserting his authority. He walked over slowly, deliberately, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the floor. Maria continued gathering the sheet music, apologizing quietly. She could feel his presence looming over her, casting a shadow across the scattered papers. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the last few sheets. Professor Ashford picked up one of the papers and examined it with exaggerated care. It was a complex piano composition by Rachmaninoff, one of the pieces his advanced students were studying. He held it up to the light as if checking for damage, though the paper was perfectly fine. The students watched in silence, sensing that something uncomfortable was about to happen. He looked down at Maria, still kneeling on the floor, and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. His tone was dripping with condescension, each word carefully chosen to emphasize the distance between them. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she realized he was about to make an example of her. The professor began to speak about the value of music, about how these sheets of paper represented years of dedication and artistic brilliance. He talked about Rachmaninoff's genius, about the countless hours students spent mastering such complex compositions. His voice grew louder, more theatrical as he warmed to his subject. The students shifted uncomfortably, but nobody dared to interrupt. Then he turned his attention fully to Maria. He asked her if she had any idea what she was holding, if she understood the significance of the music she had scattered across the floor. His questions were rhetorical, designed not to receive answers but to highlight what he saw as her ignorance. He spoke about how some people spent their entire lives dedicated to understanding music, while others simply pushed brooms and emptied trash cans. Maria remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had learned long ago that arguing with people in power only made things worse. She continued gathering the papers, trying to make herself invisible, hoping the moment would pass quickly. But Professor Ashford was just getting started. He gestured grandly toward the practice rooms and concert hall, speaking about the years of training required to even begin to appreciate classical music. He mentioned his own credentials, his performances, his publications. Every sentence was designed to elevate himself while diminishing her. The students looked away, embarrassed for Maria but too intimidated to speak up. One student, a young woman named Sarah, felt particularly uncomfortable. She had seen Maria many times, always working quietly, always polite. Sarah had once stayed late practicing and had seen Maria pause outside the practice room, listening to her play. There had been something in the janitor's expression that Sarah couldn't quite place, a depth of attention that seemed unusual. Professor Ashford finally handed the papers back to Maria with a dismissive gesture. He made a comment about how people should stick to what they know. how not everyone was meant to understand the finer things in life. He suggested that perhaps Maria should be more careful around things of value, things that were clearly beyond her comprehension. His words cut deep, and Maria felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She stood up slowly, the papers clutched in her hands, and mumbled another apology. Professor Ashford had already turned away, satisfied with his performance. He instructed one of the students to refile the music properly, as if Maria couldn't be trusted with even that simple task. The students dispersed quickly, relieved that the uncomfortable scene was over. Maria returned to her cart and continued her work, but the morning's humiliation stayed with her. She had endured many slights over the years, many moments when people looked through her rather than at her. But something about Professor Ashford's words had struck particularly deep. Perhaps it was the public nature of the humiliation, or the casual cruelty in his tone, or the way he had used her to make himself look superior in front of his students. As she cleaned the rest of the hallway, Maria thought about her life before Westfield. She thought about the choices she had made, the dreams she had set aside, the person she used to be. The memories were painful, like pressing on a bruise, but they also reminded her that she was more than what people saw when they looked at her uniform and cleaning cart. Professor Ashford returned to his office and forgot about the incident within minutes. To him, it had been nothing more than a momentary interruption to his day, a chance to remind everyone of the hierarchy that governed their world. He had no idea that his words had opened a door that would soon change everything. The days following the incident passed slowly for Maria. She went about her duties with the same quiet efficiency as always, but something had shifted inside her. Every time she walked past the music department, she felt a mixture of shame and something else, something that felt almost like anger. It was an unfamiliar feeling for someone who had spent years making herself small and invisible. Sarah, the student who had witnessed the confrontation, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She found herself looking for Maria during her practice sessions, watching the way the janitor moved through the building. There was a grace to Maria's movements that seemed out of place somehow, a careful precision that went beyond mere efficiency. One evening, Sarah stayed late practicing a particularly difficult Chopin nocturne. The music building was nearly empty, just a few dedicated students scattered in various practice rooms. The notes echoed through the hallways, creating a haunting atmosphere. Sarah was frustrated with a particular passage, playing it over and over, trying to capture the right emotion. Maria was cleaning the hallway outside, moving slowly to avoid disturbing the students. She paused when she heard Sarah's playing, and despite herself, she stopped to listen. The young woman was talented, but she was approaching the piece too technically, missing the deeper emotional current that ran beneath the notes. Maria's fingers twitched slightly, unconsciously moving through the correct fingering, the right touch that would bring the music to life. Sarah noticed the shadow in the doorway and looked up, startled. Maria apologized quickly and began to move away, but Sarah surprised both of them by calling her back. The student's voice was gentle, almost hesitant. She asked if Maria liked music, if she enjoyed hearing the students practice. It was a simple question, but it was more acknowledgement than Maria usually received. Maria paused, uncertain how to respond. She could have given a simple answer and moved on, maintaining the safe distance between their worlds. But something in Sarah's genuine curiosity made her hesitate. She admitted quietly that yes, she did enjoy the music. In fact, she loved it. The words felt dangerous, like revealing too much of herself. Sarah smiled and gestured to the piano bench, half joking that maybe Maria had some advice for her troubled passage. It was meant to be light-hearted, a moment of connection between two people who inhabited the same space but different worlds. Neither of them expected what happened next. Maria looked at the piano, then at Sarah, and something cracked in the careful wall she had built around herself. For 3 years she had walked past these instruments every day, had heard hundreds of students play, had listened to concerts and recitals from behind closed doors. For 3 years she had kept her distance, remembering her place, accepting the role life had assigned her. But Professor Ashford's words still echoed in her mind. The casual dismissal, the assumption that she was incapable of understanding, the public humiliation, all the years of silence, all the swallowed pride, all the dreams she had buried suddenly pressed against her chest like a physical weight. She found herself walking toward the piano before she had consciously decided to move. Sarah watched in surprise as Maria set down her cleaning supplies and approached the instrument. The janitor's hands, rough and reddened from years of harsh chemicals and hard work, hovered over the keys for a moment. There was a tremor in her fingers, whether from nervousness or emotion, Sarah couldn't tell. The moment stretched out, heavy with unexpected tension. Then Maria sat down and placed her hands on the keys. The transformation was immediate and startling. Her posture shifted, her shoulders squared, and suddenly she looked like a completely different person. The uncertain janitor disappeared, replaced by someone who belonged at that piano, who had sat at countless pianos before. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms, sensing that she was about to witness something extraordinary. Maria began to play, and the world seemed to stop. The notes that flowed from the piano were not the hesitant attempts of a casual player, or the mechanical precision of a diligent student. This was something else entirely. Her rough hands moved across the keys with a fluidity and grace that seemed impossible, coaxing sounds from the instrument that Sarah had never heard before, even from Professor Ashford himself. She played the same Chopin nocturne that Sarah had been struggling with, but it was utterly transformed. Every note was infused with deep emotion, with years of longing and loss and love. The music spoke of moonlit nights and distant memories, of beauty that breaks the heart precisely because it is so fleeting. Maria's hands danced across the keys, executing the difficult passages with effortless precision, but more than that, making the music breathe and live. Sarah stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, tears forming in her eyes without her even realizing it. She had studied music her entire life, had heard countless performances, but this was different. This wasn't just technical mastery, though the technical skill was undeniable. This was music played by someone who had lived it, who carried it in their bones, who understood it in a way that transcended theory and practice. The piece ended, the final notes fading into silence. Maria's hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just done. Then reality came rushing back. She looked at her hands, at the piano, at Sarah's shocked face, and the weight of exposure crashed over her. She had revealed herself, had stepped out of the safe invisibility that had protected her. She stood up quickly, almost knocking over the bench. Apologies tumbled from her lips as she backed away from the piano. Sarah tried to speak, tried to ask the 1,000 questions suddenly flooding her mind, but Maria was already gathering her cleaning supplies. The janitor's mask had slammed back into place, but it was too late. Sarah had seen behind it, had witnessed something that couldn't be unseen. Maria hurried down the hallway, her heart pounding. What had she done? 3 years of careful anonymity, destroyed in a moment of weakness. She could already imagine the questions, the attention, all the things she had been trying to avoid. She had broken her own rules, had let emotion override caution, and now she would have to face the consequences. Sarah remained in the practice room, staring at the piano, as if it might offer some explanation. Her hands were shaking slightly. She replayed what she had just heard in her mind, trying to make sense of it. Who was Maria Santos? Where had she learned to play like that? And why was she working as a janitor when she possessed such extraordinary talent? The questions multiplied, each one leading to more mysteries. The next day, Sarah found herself looking for Maria with new urgency. She needed to talk to her, to understand what she had witnessed, but Maria seemed to have vanished. She completed her cleaning duties with even more efficiency than usual, avoiding the areas where students gathered, finishing her work and disappearing before anyone could catch her. But Sarah was persistent. She asked other staff members about Maria, learning small details that suddenly seemed significant. Maria always arrived before everyone else. She had worked at the university for 3 years but never talked about her past. She was quiet, reliable, and kept entirely to herself. Nobody knew anything about her life before Westfield, and nobody had thought to ask. Professor Ashford, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware that anything had changed. He continued his lectures and masterclasses, secure in his position and reputation. He had no idea that the janitor he had humiliated possessed a gift that rivaled or perhaps exceeded his own. He had no idea that the careful order of his world was about to be turned upside down. Sarah couldn't let it go. The memory of Maria's playing haunted her through classes and practice sessions. She found herself making mistakes in pieces she had mastered years ago, distracted by thoughts of the mysterious janitor who had transformed before her eyes. Finally, after 3 days of searching, she found Maria cleaning the faculty lounge early one morning. Maria saw Sarah approaching and her first instinct was to flee. She busied herself with wiping down tables, hoping the student would simply pass by. But Sarah planted herself directly in Maria's path, her expression determined. The young woman spoke softly but firmly, asking Maria to please talk to her, to explain what she had witnessed. The desperation in Sarah's voice made it impossible for Maria to simply walk away. They sat in a small alcove near the student lounge, far from the main traffic of the building. Maria's hands twisted nervously in her lap as Sarah waited patiently. Finally, the words began to flow. Maria told her story in quiet, halting sentences, revealing a past she had kept locked away for years. Maria had grown up in a small town in the Philippines, the daughter of a piano teacher. Music had been her entire world from the moment her mother placed her tiny hands on the keys at age 4. She had shown remarkable talent from the beginning, the kind of natural gift that teachers dream of finding. By her teenage years, she was performing in regional competitions, winning scholarships, dreaming of concert halls and international stages. Her mother had sacrificed everything to nurture her talent. They had lived modestly, pouring every spare peso into Maria's education and training. Her mother gave her own lessons by day and worked in a factory at night, driven by an absolute belief in her daughter's potential. Maria had been accepted to study at the prestigious Philippine High School for the Arts, then later received a full scholarship to study piano performance at the University of the Philippines. Her professors had called her extraordinary. She performed in competitions across Southeast Asia, winning awards and recognition. By 25, she had begun to make a name for herself in the classical music world. She had given recitals in Manila, Bangkok, and Singapore. Critics praised her technical mastery and the deep emotional intelligence of her performances. The future seemed limitless. Then her mother became ill. Cancer, aggressive and merciless. The medical bills mounted rapidly, consuming their modest savings within months. Maria canceled performances to care for her mother, watching helplessly as the disease progressed. Her mother insisted she continue playing, continue pursuing her dreams, but how could she focus on Rachmaninoff when the person she loved most was fading away? Her mother passed away 2 weeks before Maria's 30th birthday. The grief was overwhelming, crushing, but worse than the grief was the debt. The medical bills had accumulated into an impossible mountain. Maria sold everything they owned, including her mother's piano, the instrument that had started it all. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. She stopped performing. Every time she sat at a piano, she heard her mother's voice, felt the weight of unfulfilled promises and dreams that had died alongside her. The depression was thick and suffocating. Friends from the music world tried to reach out, but Maria pulled away from everyone, unable to face their pity or their expectations. A cousin who had immigrated to America years earlier offered her a lifeline. Come to the United States, start fresh, find work. The cousin had connections that could help her get a work visa. It wasn't what Maria had dreamed of, but she was drowning in debt and memories. She accepted. She arrived in America 5 years ago with 2 suitcases and a heart full of broken pieces. The work visa was for domestic work, not performance. Her credentials from the Philippines meant little here. She took whatever job she could find, sending money back home to pay off the remaining medical debts. She worked as a housekeeper, a restaurant worker, a hotel cleaner. Eventually, she found the job at Westfield University. The irony wasn't lost on her, working in a music building surrounded by the very things she had lost. But she needed the steady paycheck and the health insurance. She told herself she could handle it, that she could walk these halls and hear the music without being destroyed by it. For 3 years, she had maintained that careful distance. She cleaned the practice rooms but never touched the pianos. She listened to students and faculty perform, but never allowed herself to even think about playing. She had built a wall between who she was and who she had been, and she had been determined to keep it intact. Sarah listened to the story with tears streaming down her face. She understood now why Maria had reacted so strongly to Professor Ashford's mockery. The professor had dismissed her as someone incapable of understanding music, someone who existed in a completely different world. He had no idea he was speaking to someone who had devoted her entire life to that very art, someone who had sacrificed everything for it. Maria wiped her own eyes, surprised to find herself crying. She hadn't told anyone this story, hadn't spoken about her past since arriving at Westfield. Keeping it buried had been easier than facing the loss. But Sarah's genuine interest and respect had opened something inside her, and now the words wouldn't stop. She talked about how it felt to walk past the pianos every day, to hear students struggle with pieces she had once performed flawlessly. She described the physical pain of keeping herself from playing, like holding her breath underwater. She admitted that sometimes, when the building was completely empty, she would stand outside the concert hall and imagine herself on that stage. Imagine the audience, the lights, the music flowing through her. Sarah asked the question that was burning in her mind. Why not play again? Why not tell someone about her background, her training, her talent? Surely there was a place for her in the music world even now. Maria could teach, could perform, could do something other than hide behind a mop and bucket. Maria shook her head slowly. The music world had moved on without her. 5 years was an eternity in performance. Her hands had grown stiff from cleaning work, her muscles and tendons no longer conditioned for hours of practice. Even if she could physically return to playing, the thought of putting herself out there again, of risking rejection and failure, was terrifying. She had built a safe, small life, and despite its limitations, it was predictable. It didn't hurt. Sarah pressed gently, suggesting that Maria at least try. The university had resources, connections. Perhaps she could audition for teaching positions or give small performances. But Maria resisted every suggestion. The fear was too great, the wounds still too raw. She had made peace with her choices, or at least she had learned to live with them. As they talked, other students began arriving for their morning classes. Maria stood up abruptly, remembering her place. She thanked Sarah for listening, but begged her not to tell anyone what she had heard, what she had learned. Sarah reluctantly agreed, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. Maria returned to her cart and her cleaning duties, but something had changed. Speaking the truth aloud had loosened something inside her. The memories she had kept locked away were now loose, floating through her consciousness at unexpected moments. She found herself pausing outside practice rooms, really listening to the music instead of just enduring it. That evening, long after everyone had left, Maria found herself standing outside the main concert hall. The door was unlocked, the space dark and empty. She had cleaned this room hundreds of times but had never allowed herself to really look at it, to acknowledge what it represented. Now she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The grand piano sat on the stage, majestic and waiting. Maria walked toward it slowly, her heart pounding. She told herself she was just checking if it needed cleaning, but she knew that was a lie. She sat down on the bench, her hands hovering over the keys, trembling with anticipation and fear. She played a single note. The sound rang out pure and clear in the empty hall, and something inside Maria cracked wide open. Before she could stop herself, she was playing, really playing for the first time in years. Not carefully, not holding back, but with all the emotion and skill she had been suppressing. The music poured out of her, a river that had been dammed too long. She didn't know that someone was listening. David Martinez, the university's concert hall manager, had returned to retrieve his forgotten phone from his office. He was halfway down the corridor when he heard the music. At first, he assumed one of the advanced students had stayed late to practice, but as he got closer, he realized this was no student. This was something extraordinary. He stood outside the concert hall doors, listening in stunned silence. David had managed this venue for 15 years, had heard countless performances by professionals and amateurs alike. He knew quality when he heard it, and what was coming from that piano was world-class. Whoever was playing possessed not just technical mastery, but that rare quality that separated good musicians from great ones, the ability to make the instrument sing with genuine emotion. Maria played for nearly an hour, lost in the music. She performed pieces she hadn't touched in years, her hands remembering what her mind had tried to forget. Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff, each composer flowing into the next. It was like having a conversation with an old friend, painful but necessary. Tears ran down her face, but she kept playing. When she finally stopped, the silence felt heavy. Maria sat with her hands in her lap, emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter. She had forgotten how playing could feel like this, like releasing something trapped inside her chest. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in that feeling without guilt or fear. Then she heard the applause, a single person clapping, the sound echoing through the empty hall. Maria's head snapped up in panic. David walked down the aisle toward the stage, still applauding, his expression one of absolute amazement. Maria stood up quickly, apologies already forming on her lips. But David raised his hand to stop her. He asked her directly who she was and where she had trained. There was no accusation in his voice, only genuine curiosity and respect. Maria's instinct was to deflect, to retreat back into invisibility, but David's sincere interest made it impossible to simply brush him off. Besides, she was tired of hiding. The conversation with Sarah had already begun to crack her carefully constructed walls. She gave him a condensed version of her story, leaving out some of the painful details but hitting the main points. David listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as he understood the tragedy of her situation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing what he had heard. Then he made a proposition that would change everything. The university's spring concert series was coming up in 2 months. One of the scheduled performers had recently canceled due to a family emergency, leaving an open slot. The series featured a mix of faculty, professional guests, and exceptional students. David wanted Maria to fill that slot. He wanted her to perform. Maria's immediate response was to refuse. The idea was absurd, impossible, terrifying. She was a janitor, not a performer. She hadn't practiced seriously in years. Her hands were damaged from cleaning work. She had no recent performance history, no recordings, nothing to prove she was worthy of such a stage. Every excuse poured out of her in a rush of panic. David remained calm and patient. He pointed out what he had just heard with his own ears. Whatever Maria thought about her current abilities, the music spoke for itself. Yes, she might need some practice to get back into performance shape, but the foundation was clearly still there. More importantly, the passion was there. The deep connection to the music that couldn't be taught or faked. He explained that the concert series was meant to showcase exceptional talent, regardless of background. The audience came to hear great music, not to scrutinize resumes. If Maria could play like she had just played, they would be privileged to hear her. He offered to help her prepare, to provide practice time in the concert hall to handle all the administrative details. Maria felt pulled in 2 directions. Part of her wanted desperately to say yes, to reclaim this part of herself that she had buried. But another part, the part that had learned to protect herself through invisibility and caution, screamed at her to refuse. What if she failed? What if her hands couldn't handle the rigorous practice required? What if people judged her for being a janitor who presumed to perform alongside faculty and professionals? David seemed to sense her internal struggle. He told her she didn't have to decide immediately, but he urged her to at least consider it. He gave her his contact information and asked her to think about it overnight. Then he said something that struck deep. He told her that talent like hers was rare and precious, and that it would be a genuine loss to the world if fear kept her from sharing it. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling, David's words echoing in her mind. She thought about her mother, who had believed so completely in her gift. She thought about all the years of sacrifice, all the hours of practice, all the dreams that had been built and then shattered. Was it betraying her mother's memory to hide her talent, or was it betraying her memory to risk everything again? She thought about Professor Ashford's dismissive words, his casual assumption that she was incapable of understanding music. Part of her wanted to prove him wrong, to show him and everyone else who looked through her that she was more than her uniform suggested. But another part warned her that seeking validation through performance was dangerous, that she was setting herself up for heartbreak. By morning, she still hadn't decided. She went to work as usual, but everything felt different now. The walls she had built were crumbling and she couldn't seem to repair them. Sarah noticed the change immediately and pulled her aside during a break. Maria told her about David's offer, about the impossible decision she faced. Sarah's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. She insisted that Maria had to do it, that this was a second chance she couldn't let pass by. But Maria voiced all her fears, all the practical concerns that kept her paralyzed. What about her job? If she failed, if people mocked her or rejected her performance, she would still have to work here, face these people every day. The risk seemed too great. Sarah listened carefully, then asked Maria a simple question. If she refused this opportunity, would she regret it? Not now, not tomorrow, but years from now, at the end of her life, would she regret not trying? The question hit Maria like a physical blow because she knew the answer immediately. Yes, she would regret it. She would regret it forever. Over the next week, Maria wrestled with the decision. She found herself walking past the concert hall repeatedly, staring at the doors as if they might offer some sign. She noticed David watching her sometimes, patient but hopeful. Sarah checked in daily, offering encouragement but trying not to pressure her. Finally, on a Friday evening, Maria found David in his office. Her hands were shaking and her voice was barely above a whisper, but she told him yes. She would perform in the spring concert series. Even as the words left her mouth, she felt equal parts terror and exhilaration. She had just agreed to step back into the world she had fled, to make herself vulnerable in the most public way possible. David's smile was genuine and warm. He immediately began discussing logistics. They would need to select her program, schedule practice times, prepare promotional materials. Maria felt overwhelmed by all the details, but David assured her they would take it step by step. The first priority was simply getting her hands back into performance shape. That weekend, Maria began practicing in earnest. David had given her access to the concert hall during off hours, and she used every spare moment. Her hands ached at first, the muscles and tendons protesting the unfamiliar intensive work. The pieces that had once flowed effortlessly now required concentration and repetition. There were moments of frustration and doubt when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But there were also moments of pure joy, moments when the music came together and she remembered why she had devoted her life to this art. Each small victory, each passage successfully executed, built her confidence slightly. She was rusty but not broken. The foundation was still there, and with work, she could rebuild. Sarah became her unofficial assistant, helping her select pieces for the program and offering encouragement during difficult practice sessions. The young student's enthusiasm was infectious, and her genuine belief in Maria's talent helped counter some of Maria's self-doubt. They formed an unlikely friendship, bridging the gap between their different worlds. As the weeks passed, word began to spread quietly through the music department that something unusual was happening. Students noticed that Maria's cleaning schedule had changed, that she seemed distracted and purposeful in a new way. David had kept his promise not to announce anything until Maria was ready, but rumors began circulating anyway. Professor Ashford heard whispers about a special performer being added to the spring concert series, but he paid little attention. He was too focused on preparing his own students for their performances and maintaining his reputation as the department's leading figure. He had no idea that the janitor he had dismissed so casually was about to step into the spotlight. He had no idea that his comfortable world of assumptions and hierarchies was about to be challenged in the most dramatic way possible. 6 weeks before the scheduled performance, David called a meeting with the department chair to finalize the concert series program. Professor Ashford attended as head of the music department, along with several other faculty members. David distributed the updated program booklets, which included brief biographies of each performer. When Professor Ashford reached Maria's page, he froze. The biography was brief but powerful. It mentioned Maria's training in the Philippines, her early career successes, and simply noted that she was currently affiliated with Westfield University. There was no mention of her janitorial work, but David had deliberately kept the description vague enough to spark curiosity. The program listed her performance pieces: Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a Chopin Nocturne, and Debussy's Clair de Lune. Professor Ashford's face flushed red as he read the name. Maria Santos. It couldn't be the same person, could it? He looked up at David and asked directly if this was the janitor. David confirmed calmly that yes, Maria Santos, who worked in the music building, would be performing. The room went silent. Several faculty members exchanged confused glances. The professor's reaction was immediate and explosive. He demanded to know what kind of joke this was, whether David had lost his mind. How could he possibly put a cleaning woman on the same program as trained professionals and serious students? It was an insult to everyone else performing, a mockery of the concert series' reputation. His voice grew louder with each sentence, his indignation on full display. David remained calm, which only seemed to infuriate Professor Ashford more. The concert hall manager explained that he had heard Maria play personally and that she possessed extraordinary talent. Her performance would be an asset to the program, not a liability. He reminded everyone that the concert series was meant to showcase exceptional musicianship, regardless of the performer's current occupation. but Professor Ashford wouldn't hear it. He brought up the incident with the sheet music, describing Maria as careless and ignorant. He painted a picture of her as someone who had no business being anywhere near a performance stage. How could someone who pushed a mop around all day possibly have the discipline and refinement required for classical performance? The other faculty members looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up to challenge him. David finally allowed a hint of steel to enter his voice. He stated firmly that Maria had already been confirmed and that promotional materials were being prepared. Unless Professor Ashford had heard her play personally and could offer a professional evaluation of her abilities, his objections were based on prejudice rather than evidence. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the professor's authority. Professor Ashford stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He declared that he wanted nothing to do with this circus and that he wouldn't attend the concert. Several other faculty members murmured their support for him, though some looked uncertain. The department chair tried to mediate, suggesting they at least hear Maria play before making final judgments, but Professor Ashford was already leaving the room. News of the confrontation spread through the music department within hours. Students buzzed with gossip and speculation. Some were excited by the drama, others skeptical about Maria's abilities. A few, including Sarah, became even more determined to support her. The pressure on Maria intensified dramatically. Though David tried to shield her from the worst of it, Maria heard about Professor Ashford's reaction through Sarah. The news hit her hard, confirming her deepest fears. She had known that stepping into the spotlight would expose her to judgment and criticism, but having it happen so publicly and viciously made everything feel more real and more frightening. She called David, voice shaking, and said she wanted to withdraw from the concert. David drove to her apartment that evening and talked with her for 3 hours. He acknowledged her fears but urged her not to let Professor Ashford's prejudice dictate her choices. The professor's reaction said everything about his character and nothing about her abilities. David reminded her of how far she had already come in just a few weeks of practice, how the music had come alive under her hands. Maria listened, wanting desperately to believe him. But the old wounds had been reopened, all the insecurities and doubts flooding back. What if she performed and proved Professor Ashford right? What if she froze on stage or made mistakes? What if people laughed at her? The thought of public humiliation was almost paralyzing. David made her a promise. If she committed to seeing this through, he would ensure she had every resource and support she needed. More importantly, he reminded her of something crucial. She wasn't playing to prove anything to Professor Ashford or anyone else. She was playing for herself, for her mother's memory, for the love of music that had defined her life. Everything else was just noise. Something in David's words reached through Maria's fear. She thought about her mother, about all the sacrifices made for her gift. She thought about the years she had spent hiding, shrinking, making herself small. Was she really going to let an arrogant professor rob her of this chance? Was his opinion worth more than her own truth? She told David she would continue, but her voice was filled with uncertainty. He accepted that, knowing that commitment didn't require the absence of fear, only the willingness to move forward despite it. They set up an intensive practice schedule for the remaining weeks, and David recruited several supportive faculty members to help Maria prepare. The following weeks were grueling. Maria practiced until her hands cramped, working through passages again and again until they flowed naturally. David brought in a piano technician to ensure the concert hall's grand piano was perfectly tuned to Maria's preferences. Sarah attended many of the practice sessions, offering emotional support and practical feedback from a student's perspective. As word spread about the controversy, an interesting thing happened. Students began attending Maria's practice sessions, curious about the mysterious janitor who had sparked such drama. At first, Maria found the audience terrifying, but gradually she began to adjust to playing with people watching. The students' reactions were overwhelmingly positive, their enthusiasm helping to counter her doubts. Professor Ashford heard about these unofficial performances and grew increasingly irritated. He made snide comments in his classes about the decline of professional standards and the difference between playing notes and true musicianship. Some of his students repeated these comments, but others began to question their teacher's judgment, especially after sneaking into one of Maria's practice sessions themselves. 3 weeks before the concert, The department chair requested a private meeting with Professor Ashford. She had attended one of Maria's rehearsals at David's invitation and had been genuinely impressed. She urged the professor to reconsider his position, to at least hear Maria play before maintaining his boycott of the concert. The university president had also taken notice of the situation and wasn't pleased with the division in the music department. Professor Ashford refused to budge. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit he might have been wrong about Maria. Instead, he doubled down, telling other faculty members that the concert would be an embarrassment and that allowing Maria to perform showed how far standards had fallen at Westfield. His campaign created a tense atmosphere in the department, with faculty and students taking sides. Maria tried to ignore the politics and focus on her preparation, but it was impossible to completely escape the tension. She heard the whispers, noticed people staring at her, felt the weight of expectations growing heavier each day. There were moments when the pressure felt unbearable, when she wanted to run away and never look back. Sarah became Maria's anchor during these difficult weeks. The young student's unwavering belief helped Maria stay grounded when doubt threatened to overwhelm her. They spent hours talking between practice sessions, not just about music but about life, fear, courage, and what it meant to be true to yourself when the world had other expectations. The promotional materials for the concert were released 2 weeks before the performance. Maria's face appeared on posters around campus alongside the other performers. Seeing her own image displayed so publicly felt surreal and terrifying. She was no longer invisible, no longer safely hidden. She had put herself out into the world and there was no taking it back. The concert sold out within 3 days. Whether people were coming to witness an inspiring comeback story or to watch a potential disaster, Maria couldn't tell. But the intense interest meant that whatever happened on that stage would be very public. The pressure reached new heights and Maria found herself battling anxiety in ways she never had before her mother's death. 1 week before the concert, Maria had a complete breakdown during practice. The stress and fear finally overwhelmed her, and she collapsed at the piano, sobbing. David and Sarah were both present, and they simply sat with her, letting her release the emotion without trying to fix it or minimize it. Sometimes courage required acknowledging just how scared you really were. After she calmed down, Maria talked honestly about her fears. She admitted that part of her still wanted to run away, to return to the safe invisibility of her janitorial work, but she also acknowledged that she had come too far to turn back now. The practice had awakened something in her that couldn't be put back to sleep. Whatever happened on that stage, she needed to see it through. The final days before the concert passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and mounting anxiety. Maria barely slept, her mind running through the music constantly. She had moments of confidence when the pieces flowed perfectly, and moments of panic when her fingers stumbled. David reminded her repeatedly that perfection wasn't the goal. Honest, heartfelt performance was what mattered. Professor Ashford remained conspicuously absent from all concert preparations, though he continued to make his disapproval known. But his influence was waning as more people heard Maria play and recognized her genuine talent. Even some of his most loyal students had begun to question whether their teacher's judgment was clouded by prejudice rather than professional assessment. The day of the concert arrived with brilliant sunshine that seemed almost mocking, given Maria's internal turmoil. She had requested the day off from her janitorial duties, and for the first time in 3 years she entered the music building not as a worker, but as a performer. The difference felt monumental, like stepping into an alternate version of her own life. David had arranged for Maria to have a private dressing room, the same accommodation given to all featured performers. She arrived 4 hours before the concert, needing time to center herself and mentally prepare. Sarah came by with flowers and words of encouragement. Other students who had attended practice sessions stopped by to wish her well. Their support helped, but couldn't completely calm the storm of anxiety in her chest. Professor Ashford spent the day in his office, deliberately avoiding all concert preparations. Several colleagues had urged him to attend, if only to maintain appearances, but his stubbornness and pride kept him away. He told himself that he was taking a principled stand against the lowering of standards, but deep down, a small voice questioned whether his resistance was really about standards or about ego. As evening approached, the concert hall began to fill. The audience was larger than usual, drawn by curiosity and the controversy surrounding Maria's participation. University students mixed with faculty, community members, and local music enthusiasts. There was an electric energy in the air, a sense that something significant might happen. Backstage, Maria went through her warm-up routine with trembling hands. She wore a simple but elegant black dress that Sarah had helped her choose, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Looking at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the person staring back. She looked like a performer, like the person she used to be, and the image was both thrilling and terrifying. The concert began with a faculty string quartet, followed by 2 advanced students performing solo pieces. Maria watched from backstage, her anxiety building with each passing moment. Her performance was scheduled near the end of the program, which meant enduring nearly an hour of anticipation. Every sound from the audience made her jump. Every round of applause reminded her that soon she would be the one standing under those lights. David checked on her repeatedly, his calm presence helping to ground her. He reminded her to breathe, to focus on the music rather than the audience, to trust in all the hours of preparation. Sarah stood nearby, ready to offer support or simply squeeze Maria's hand when the fear became too intense. They formed a small circle of protection around her, their belief in her ability creating a buffer against her own doubts. Finally, it was time. David walked onto the stage to introduce her, and Maria's heart felt like it might explode from her chest. She heard him speaking about her background, her training in the Philippines, her early career success. He spoke respectfully about the difficult journey that had brought her to this moment, without being overly dramatic or turning her into a tragedy. Then he invited her to the stage. The walk from the wings to the piano felt like crossing an ocean. The stage lights were blinding, making the audience a dark mass of anonymous faces. Maria's legs felt weak, and for one horrible moment she thought she might faint. But muscle memory and years of performance experience kicked in. She reached the piano, bowed to acknowledge the applause, and sat down. The audience quieted, waiting. Maria placed her hands on the keys, and in that moment of silence before the first note, she felt a strange calm descend. This was familiar territory. This was home. Whatever happened after for the next hour, she belonged exactly where she was. She began with the Chopin Nocturne, the same piece Sarah had been practicing the night everything changed. The opening notes floated out into the hall, delicate and haunting. Maria let the music guide her, no longer thinking about technique or the audience, simply feeling each note as it resonated through the instrument and into the space around her. The transformation was immediate and total. This wasn't a janitor playing piano. This was an artist in complete command of her craft. Her hands moved across the keys with fluid grace, coaxing sounds of breathtaking beauty from the instrument. Every phrase was shaped with intention, every dynamic carefully controlled yet emotionally spontaneous. The music seemed to breathe, to live, to speak directly to something deep in the listeners' souls. In the audience, people sat transfixed. Students who had come out of curiosity found themselves blinking back tears. Faculty members who had been skeptical felt their objections dissolving with each passing measure. The music demanded attention, commanded respect, and most importantly, it moved people in ways that transcended technical analysis. Sarah sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face filled with joy and vindication. She had known Maria possessed this gift, had heard glimpses of it, but witnessing it fully realized in front of hundreds of people was overwhelming. She glanced around and saw the same stunned expressions on faces throughout the hall. This wasn't just good playing. This was something special, something rare. Across campus in his office, Professor Ashford sat reading a journal article, deliberately ignoring the concert. But even at that distance, with windows closed, he could hear faint strains of music drifting across the grounds. He told himself it was his imagination, that he was too far away to actually hear anything. But something made him pause, made him listen more carefully. The Chopin ended to thunderous applause. Maria remained still for a moment, letting the final notes fade completely before acknowledging the audience. When she finally looked up and saw the standing ovation, the tears in people's eyes, she felt something shift inside her. This was why she had devoted her life to music. Not for acclaim or recognition, but for these moments of pure connection, when the music bridged the gap between performer and listener and created something transcendent. She moved into the Debussy, and if possible, her playing became even more nuanced and expressive. Claire de Lune washed over the audience like moonlight, each phrase painted with delicate precision. The piece was technically challenging, but she made it seem effortless, her focus entirely on the emotional landscape of the music. People in the audience forgot they were sitting in a concert hall and found themselves transported to the quiet, contemplative space the music created. Back in his office, Professor Ashford found himself walking to the window. The music was definitely audible now, carried on the evening breeze. He recognized the Debussy, recognized the extraordinary skill required to perform it properly. And despite his determination to remain disconnected from the concert, he found himself listening. Really listening. What he heard made him uncomfortable in ways he didn't want to examine. The playing was exceptional. Not good, not impressive, but genuinely exceptional. Whoever was performing possessed not just technical mastery, but that indefinable quality that separated competent musicians from true artists. And he knew, though he didn't want to admit it, that it had to be Maria Santos. Maria finished the Debussy to even more enthusiastic applause. She took a brief pause, using the moment to gather herself for the final piece, the most challenging of the program. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, performed without orchestra in a solo piano arrangement, was a test of both technique and endurance. It was the piece that had been scattered across the floor when Professor Ashford had mocked her, and she had chosen it deliberately. As she began the opening chords, powerful and dramatic, everyone in the hall could feel the intensity. This was music that demanded everything from the performer, technically brutal and emotionally exhausting. Maria poured herself into it, her hands flying across the keys, her body swaying with the music's passionate phrases. The famous second movement brought tears to many eyes. Maria played it with such profound emotion, such deep understanding of loss and longing, that it felt like she was telling her own story through Rachmaninoff's notes. The music spoke of dreams deferred, of grief overcome, of beauty found in the midst of suffering. It was autobiographical in a way that transcended words. Professor Ashford found himself unable to look away from his window, unable to stop listening. The music reached him despite all his resistance, and it forced him to confront truths he had been avoiding. He had judged Maria based on her position, her appearance, her role in the university hierarchy. He had assumed that someone who cleaned floors couldn't possibly understand music the way he did. And he had been catastrophically wrong. The final movement built to its climactic conclusion, Maria's hands racing across the keyboard with breathtaking speed and precision. She held nothing back, pouring years of suppressed emotion and denied passion into the music. When she struck the final chords, powerful and definitive, the silence that followed was electric. Then the audience erupted. People leaped to their feet, applauding wildly, some shouting their appreciation. It was the kind of response usually reserved for world-famous performers, not university concert series. Maria sat at the piano, emotionally drained, barely able to process what had just happened. She had done it. Despite all her fears, all the obstacles, she had reclaimed this part of herself. The ovation continued for several minutes. Maria stood and bowed repeatedly, overwhelmed by the response. People were crying, embracing each other, caught up in the emotional power of what they had just experienced. It was the kind of performance that reminded everyone present why music mattered, why it had the power to transform and transcend. Professor Ashford stood at his window, the applause audible even from his office. His hands gripped the windowsill, his face a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. Shame, certainly. Regret, but also something else. Something that felt like his entire understanding of the world shifting beneath his feet. He had built his identity on certain assumptions about talent, education, and worth. And in one evening, a janitor he had dismissed had challenged all of it. After the concert ended, the crowd didn't want to leave. People lingered in the hall, still processing what they had witnessed. Maria was immediately surrounded by well-wishers, students, and faculty members eager to congratulate her. Their faces showed genuine respect. No longer seeing the janitor, but recognizing the artist she had always been. Sarah pushed through the crowd to embrace Maria, both women crying happy tears. David stood nearby with a satisfied smile, vindicated in his belief in her talent. Several faculty members who had been skeptical approached to offer genuine apologies and praise. The department chair made a point of speaking with Maria privately, already hinting at future opportunities. Videos of the performance, recorded by audience members on their phones, began circulating on social media within minutes. By the next morning, clips had been viewed thousands of times, with people sharing the story of the janitor with extraordinary talent. Local news stations picked up the story, fascinated by the human interest angle. Suddenly, Maria Santos was no longer invisible. Professor Ashford spent a sleepless night in his office, unable to shake what he had heard. He had built his entire professional identity on being the authority, the expert, the one who determined who had talent and who didn't. Maria's performance had exposed the hollowness of those assumptions. Worse, it had forced him to confront the cruelty of his earlier dismissal of her. The next morning, the music building buzzed with excitement. Students talked about nothing but Maria's performance. Faculty members discussed the technical aspects and emotional depth of her playing. The concert had become legendary almost instantly, one of those rare moments when something transcendent happens and everyone present knows they witnessed something special. Maria arrived for her regular janitorial shift, uncertain what to expect. Everything felt different now. Students who had previously walked past her without a glance stopped to congratulate her. Faculty members smiled and nodded respectfully. The invisible woman had become visible, and she wasn't sure how to navigate this new reality. She was cleaning near the practice rooms when Professor Ashford finally appeared. He had avoided the building earlier, unable to face the conversations he knew were happening. But eventually he couldn't hide anymore. He saw Maria down the corridor, mop in hand, and felt a wave of shame so intense it was almost physical. He approached slowly, trying to find words for something he had never been good at expressing. Apology, humility, recognition of his own failures. Maria saw him coming and her body tensed, old fears rising despite the previous night's triumph. She set down her mop, preparing herself for whatever confrontation was coming. But when Professor Ashford spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of its usual arrogance. He told her he had heard her performance from his office. He admitted he had been wrong about her, wrong in ways that went beyond simple misjudgment. He acknowledged the cruelty of his earlier words, the dismissiveness, the public humiliation he had inflicted. His apology was halting and uncomfortable, but it was genuine. Maria listened without interrupting, her expression carefully neutral. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told him that his apology was appreciated, but that the real damage he had done was not to her but to himself. By making assumptions based on position and appearance, by refusing to see beyond surface roles, he had limited his own understanding and denied himself the opportunity to recognize talent when it stood right in front of him. Her words were not angry or vindictive, just honest. She explained that she had learned through her own journey that talent and worth weren't determined by job titles or social position. She had been a celebrated performer, and she had been a janitor, and in both roles she had been the same person with the same gift. The only thing that changed was whether people chose to see it. Professor Ashford absorbed her words, feeling their weight. He asked what she planned to do now, whether she would continue working at the university or pursue performance opportunities. Maria admitted she didn't know. The concert had opened doors, but it had also complicated everything. She had built a safe, simple life, and suddenly that life was no longer simple at all. Over the following weeks, Maria received multiple offers. Music programs wanted her to teach. Performance venues invited her to give recitals. A recording company expressed interest in producing an album. The opportunities were exciting but overwhelming. She had spent so long invisible that being suddenly visible, suddenly in demand, felt disorienting. Sarah helped her navigate the offers, providing a sounding board for Maria's thoughts and fears. David advocated for her to be given an official teaching position at Westfield, arguing that her unique story and undeniable talent would be invaluable to students. The university administration, aware of the positive publicity surrounding Maria's story, was surprisingly receptive. Professor Ashford, meanwhile, found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about teaching and music. He began listening more carefully to students he had previously dismissed. He questioned his assumptions about talent and potential. The experience had cracked something in his carefully constructed certainty, and while it was uncomfortable, it also felt like necessary growth. A month after the concert, Maria made her decision. She accepted a part-time teaching position at Westfield, which would allow her to share her knowledge with students while also pursuing occasional performance opportunities. She would leave her janitorial position, but she was clear that she felt no shame about the work she had done. It had sustained her during a difficult time and had ultimately led her back to music. Her first class as an instructor was filled with nervous anticipation. The students looked at her with respect and curiosity, eager to learn from someone whose story had already become legendary on campus. Maria stood before them, no longer in a janitor's uniform but in professional attire, and felt the full weight of how far she had traveled. She began by telling them that music wasn't about credentials or pedigree or social position. It was about connection, emotion, and the willingness to be vulnerable in pursuit of something beautiful. She shared parts of her story, not to elicit sympathy but to illustrate that the path to artistry wasn't always straightforward, that setbacks and struggles could deepen rather than diminish one's understanding. Professor Ashford attended one of her early classes, standing quietly in the back. Maria noticed him but continued teaching. After class, as students filed out, he approached her. He told her that watching her teach, seeing how she connected with students and shared her knowledge with such generosity, made him realize how much he had been missing in his own approach. They had a long conversation that day. Two people who had started as antagonists finding unexpected common ground. Professor Ashford admitted that his arrogance had been born from insecurity, from a need to constantly prove his worth by elevating himself above others. Maria's grace in accepting his apology, and her refusal to gloat about her vindication had taught him more about character than years of professional success ever had their relationship transformed over time into something resembling mutual respect and even friendship. They never forgot the painful beginning, but they both chose to move forward rather than remain trapped in that moment. Professor Ashford became one of Maria's strongest advocates. Using his influence to support her career development, Maria continued to give occasional performances. Each one met with enthusiasm and critical acclaim, but she found the most satisfaction in teaching, in seeing students discover their own voices and potential. She made it a point to notice the quiet students, the ones who others might overlook, remembering how invisibility felt and ensuring no one in her presence went unseen. Sarah graduated and went on to pursue her own performance career, but she never forgot the woman who had taught her that talent could be found in unexpected places. She carried Maria's lessons with her, both musical and personal, and years later would tell Maria's story to her own students as an illustration of resilience and the dangers of prejudice. The music building at Westfield University eventually placed a plaque in the concert hall, commemorating Maria's legendary performance. Students passing by would read about the janitor who became a celebrated teacher and performer, and some would understand that the story wasn't really about a dramatic transformation. It was about a talented woman who had always been there waiting to be seen. Maria kept her old janitor's uniform in her closet, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. A reminder that worth isn't determined by job titles or social positions. A reminder that assumptions blind us to truth. A reminder that talent and dignity exist independent of recognition, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones we walk past every day without really seeing. Years later, when asked about that period of her life, Maria would say that being invisible had taught her things that performing on stages never could. It had taught her humility, resilience, and the deep truth that music exists whether anyone is listening or not. The concert hadn't made her talented. It had simply revealed what had always been there, waiting beneath the surface for the right moment to emerge. And Professor Ashford, who had learned his own hard lessons about humility and judgment, would add that sometimes the greatest teachers come in the most unexpected forms, that the janitor mopping your floors might see more, understand more, and have more to offer than you could ever imagine, if you just bothered to look beyond the surface and truly see the person standing in front of you. The story of Maria Santos became part of Westfield University's culture, passed down through generations of students. It reminded them that talent could be found anywhere, that kindness and respect should extend to everyone regardless of their role, and that assumptions about people based on their position or appearance could cause us to miss the extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Every note of music played in that building carried a little bit of her legacy, a testament to the power of seeing people for who they truly are.